In the annals of ancient Roman history, the reign of Emperor Elagabalus, who ascended to the throne at just 14 years old thanks to the devious machinations of his grandmother Julia Maesa, stands out as a period of eccentric excesses and religious upheaval. This young monarch burst onto the political scene like a comet, ushering in the cult of an Eastern deity and transforming the imperial court into an arena of outrageous spectacles that appalled the conservative Roman establishment. This narrative delves into the peculiar trajectory of the sun cult's penetration into the very heart of the empire. It will explore the scandalous marriages, conducted in defiance of all religious dogma, and describe feasts where a lethal shower of rose petals descended upon unsuspecting guests. Particular attention will be paid to Elagabalus's gender politics, his ambiguous identity, and his attempts to empower women, which provoked outrage in a patriarchal society. The conclusion will recount the conspiracy orchestrated by Julia Maesa and the emperor's tragic downfall, whilst also endeavoring to separate truth from the myths surrounding this controversial figure. Following the demise of Septimius Severus in 211 AD, the Roman Empire plunged into a state of profound instability. His successor, Caracalla, inherited a state racked by internal contradictions. The legions, accustomed to generous stipends, had become instruments of suppression, whilst the Senate, stripped of real authority, was forced to observe from the sidelines. The Praetorian Guard, playing a pivotal role in the elevation and downfall of emperors, craved new opportunities to consolidate its influence. Caracalla, renowned for his Constitutio Antoniniana, which granted citizenship to numerous provincial inhabitants, did not shy away from bloodshed and extravagance. He ruthlessly eliminated relatives and depleted the treasury to fund his extravagant schemes. In April 217 AD, Caracalla fell at the hands of a centurion whilst en route to a festival, plunging Rome into yet another spiral of political chaos. Following Caracalla's violent death, the empire found itself in a precarious state, awaiting a new ruler. His successor was Macrinus, the Praetorian prefect, a man who lacked the illustrious lineage and charisma necessary to hold power. As a seasoned administrator, he attempted to restore order and curb excessive privileges, but his decision to raise taxes incited resentment within an army that yearned for the lavish gifts bestowed upon them by Caracalla. The Senate, bereft of its former sway, was divided between outward deference to authority and simmering discontent, as it watched Rome become engulfed by protests and clandestine conspiracies. Amidst this chaotic tapestry of ambition and betrayal, Julia Maesa, kin to the late Julia Domna, discerned an opportunity to elevate her young grandson, Varius Bassianus. In the crucible of the crisis, she began to weave a web of intrigues, meticulously paving the way for one of the most scandalous reigns in Roman history. Julia Maesa, sister of the influential Julia Domna, discerned in the chaos following Caracalla's assassination a chance to reclaim her family's lost power. Demonstrating remarkable political acumen, she devised an ingenious plan to discredit the usurper Macrinus by circulating the rumor that her grandson, Varius Avitus Bassianus, was in fact Caracalla's illegitimate son. Her daughter, Julia Soaemias, ostentatiously repudiated her husband, whilst messengers spread this news amongst the legions stationed in Syria. The conspiracy culminated in Emesa, where, before the statue of Elagabalus, Centurion Publius Valerius Comazon and his soldiers proclaimed the young priest emperor. On a June night in 218 AD, Macrinus was apprehended and executed, and Bassianus, henceforth known as Elagabalus, ascended the imperial throne at just 14 years old. This coup d'état, meticulously orchestrated in the shadow of familial power, transformed Julia Maesa into the true puppeteer behind this extraordinary transfer of authority. Envisage the intricate coordination of a conspiracy where everything was at stake: lives, reputations, and the very future of an empire. Precarious rumors and purchased loyalties served as the sole foundation for such an undertaking. It was under these circumstances that Varius Avitus Bassianus, clad in the purple priestly robes of Elagabalus, presented himself before the statue of the sun deity in Emesa. There, Centurion Publius Valerius Comazon, showcasing the crown to the astonished legions, proclaimed the young priest emperor. On the night of June 8, 218 AD, Macrinus was apprehended, and his immediate execution cemented the success of the meticulously planned coup. In Rome, Bassianus adopted the name Marcus Aurelius Antoninus. At just 14 years old, his initial acts involved granting extensive powers to Julia Maesa and appointing her adherents to pivotal positions within the Praetorian Guard. Rome was aghast. A youthful emperor and seasoned generals sharing authority. The Senate, staggered by this turn of events, reluctantly acknowledged the emperor elevated by the legions. This seizure of power was no mere confluence of chance, but the culmination of a long-term familial strategy. Skillfully propagated rumors, venal adherence, and belief in an alien god converged to elevate a youth destined to irrevocably alter the face of Rome. Can one truly fathom the hushed apprehension and uncertainty as an inexperienced youth assumed governance over a vast, millennia-old empire? The era of Elagabalus's reign witnessed the introduction of the cult of Elagabalus, the sun deity revered in Emesa. Envisage a majestic procession where a stone effigy, resplendent with gold and precious stones, solemnly paraded through the streets to the beat of drums and the glow of torches. Upon reaching the Palatine Hill, the emperor commenced the construction of a grandiose temple, altering Domitian's original design intended for Jupiter. Daily, with the first rays of dawn, the cult's priests would throw open the sanctuary gates, welcoming lines of white-robed devotees. However, the ceremony's crescendo occurred at midday, when the scorching sun's rays flooded the sacred courtyard. At this moment, Elagabalus, clad in a purple cloak, would raise his scepter to the sun god, and the bronze on the altar would begin to sparkle, whilst the smoke from the incense curled in golden spirals. Senators, by imperial decree, were compelled to participate in the procession, bearing offerings of grain and wine. The high priest thunderously proclaimed Elagabalus to be the invincible sun, destined to overshadow all ancient gods. Any display of dissent, even a fleeting gesture, was met with fines or exile. The Roman pantheon suddenly found itself under the dominion of a single, exotic deity, and the Senate anxiously realized that the religious empire had donned alien vestments. One can only imagine the indignation that swept through the temples, the fury of Jupiter's priests witnessing their altars deserted, and the pervasive spread of an alien cult imposed by a youthful emperor. At the very heart of Elagabalus's magnificent temple, splendor yielded to incomprehensible horror. An era of mass sacrifices transformed the sacred altar into an arena of bloodshed, where the blood of cows, sheep, and even the progeny of noble patrician families stained the marble. Beneath the scorching sun, Elagabalus, clad in a golden toga symbolizing sunlight, would raise a gleaming knife before thousands of trembling worshippers. The thunder of Syrian drums set a frenzied rhythm, whilst crimson liquid flowed in torrents, saturating the polished marble floor. However, his extravagance reached its deadly zenith at one of his renowned feasts, where he commanded an avalanche of rose and violet petals to descend upon the triclinium's unsuspecting guests through a skylight. Initially, the guests, disoriented by wine and astonishment, greeted this spectacle with applause. Yet, the floral deluge grew steadily thicker and denser, until it began to suffocate and obstruct their airways. Many froze motionless, gasping for breath in a fragrant tomb where horror blossomed in an ominous silence. Herodian and Dio Cassius unanimously assert that this banquet was nothing less than a ritual of terror, artfully disguised beneath a veneer of luxury. Bodies fell lifeless, unaided, whilst the emperor himself seemed to derive a diabolical amusement from this slaughter, deemed worthy of a deity. Word of the lethal reign spread throughout Rome like a sinister warning. Limitless power possessed the capacity to transform beauty into an executioner. Can one truly envision being a participant in a ritual where magnificence and death dance in unison, and a single imperial gesture can turn a celebration into a deadly trap? The imperial banqueting hall comes to mind, where purple draperies cascade from high walls and tables groan under the weight of exquisite delicacies. Exotic pheasants, Nile carp, and honey-soaked pies vying with Sicilian desserts. Everything here was orchestrated as a lavish spectacle, with Elagabalus treating his guests to rare game, wine infused with eastern spices, and at times, the very blood of his victims. These feasts, lasting until the first rays of dawn, were an unending torrent of hedonism. Servants bore platters of food, and cupbearers filled goblets with a drink promising bliss. However, a sinister note lurked within this magnificence. At some banquets, the emperor commanded drops of fresh animal blood to be added to the wine, believing it would bestow divine power upon the drinkers. According to some accounts, in his pursuit of perfection, Elagabalus went so far as to use the hot blood of cult victims instead of water when preparing dishes. Amidst the intoxicating aroma of ruby-colored wine flowing like a river, he orchestrated theatrical performances. Dancers showered with rose petals, gathered from sacred temples, and then set ablaze to emit thick, intoxicating smoke. Musicians frantically beating drums, and guests vying for sweetened pig trotters or boar glands, considered potent aphrodisiacs. These orgies and ostentatious displays of wealth ran contrary to Roman notions of dignity and moderation. The satisfied emperor generously scattered coins amongst the crowd, seeking applause, whilst the Senate, maintaining a stoic silence, observed this unrestrained carnival. For the common people, these feasts became the embodiment of unrestrained power, willing to sacrifice moral principles and the state treasury to satiate its hedonistic desires. Is it possible to imagine oneself a participant in such a feast, where luxury and blood intertwine in every dish, and the desire to astound transforms into a demonstration of power, simultaneously terrifying and captivating? Elagabalus, keen to consolidate his power, contracted marriages that astonished his contemporaries with their scandalous nature, yet were strategically calculated. Firstly, he wedded Paula, daughter of the Praetorian prefect, but swiftly repudiated her, deeming her physical imperfections an affront to his vanity. He then committed an unprecedented act of sacrilege by marrying the Vestal Virgin Julia Aquilia Severa, thereby violating a 1,000-year-old vow punishable by death. Not content with the stir he had caused, he married Faustina, the great-granddaughter of Marcus Aurelius himself, hoping to secure an heir. However, a year later, he dissolved this union as Faustina failed to meet his expectations. This was followed by a bigamous union with Heracles, a Greek slave, and Aurelius Zosimus, a renowned athlete, two spouses simultaneously, whose bodies the emperor alternately admired and disdained, following his whims. Each of these marriages constituted a blatant disregard for centuries-old traditions and elicited mockery and contempt from the Roman Senate. Elagabalus's grandmother, fearing the ultimate collapse of societal norms, gradually annulled these unions, yet the damage inflicted upon the reputation of the emperor and the empire was already irreparable. Rome had never before encountered a ruler who so audaciously flouted established norms of marriage. Just imagine the plight of those coerced into marriage with this young tyrant, knowing that their union could be swiftly repudiated at the emperor's capricious whim. Emperor Elagabalus, akin to a comet, burst into the conservative world of Rome, performing acts that contravened established norms and traditions. He scandalized society by donning women's attire, skillfully applying makeup much like a priestess serving the sun god. However, behind these extravagant antics lay something more profound than a mere desire for attention. Elagabalus openly declared his aspiration to change sex, offering generous rewards to physicians willing to perform genital alteration surgery. He demanded that his subjects address him not as emperor, but as empress. In his quest for change, Elagabalus did not stop at personal transformations. He elevated his mother, Julia Soaemias, to the rank of consul, an unprecedented step in Roman history. She became the first woman to be granted voting rights and the opportunity to participate in Senate sessions. Shortly thereafter, Elagabalus established a women's senate on the Quirinal, where noble matrons discussed important decrees and established new behavioral norms. These political innovations, inspired by the traditions of Emesa, where women from the upper echelons of society wielded significant power, caused genuine shock within Roman patriarchal society. The Roman Forum resonated with indignant voices, whilst representatives of the nobility accused the emperor of distorting divine order. In a society where the concepts of dignity, and mos maiorum, ancestral custom, strictly limited the presence of women in the public sphere, Elagabalus's actions seemed inconceivable. He conflated gender identity, religious cult, and political governance into a singular act of defiance against established traditions. This peculiar blend of adherence to his convictions and transgression of accepted rules transformed Elagabalus's reign into a symbolic struggle for equality, yet simultaneously became the cause of a resounding scandal that ultimately led to his downfall. One can only imagine the horror that gripped the Roman elite as they witnessed a young emperor, clad in female dress, disregarding all conventions, and his mother occupying the consul seat in the very heart of Rome. Whilst heated debates raged within the walls of the Roman Senate regarding the empire's future, Emperor Elagabalus forged his own parallel reality of power, founded upon rampant debauchery and hedonism. He flung open the doors of the imperial palace, transforming its luxurious chambers into a vast brothel, where slaves and exiles freely offered themselves to anyone daring to cross the threshold. On one occasion, he even commanded all city prostitutes, both free and enslaved, to assemble in the Roman Forum, orchestrating a 3-day procession in their honor, complete with deafening music and dances by semi-naked performers in glittering golden tunics. At his renowned orgies, the emperor did not shy from mixing wine with hashish extract imported from distant Asia, creating an intoxicating concoction that induced euphoria and drowsiness, perfectly suited to dissolve the last vestiges of dignitas. Banquets devolved into veritable bacchanalian revels, where the distinctions between servants and guests blurred in a drunken haze. Athletes and musicians flocked to the palace hoping to gain imperial favor, and many departed under the cloak of night, having become imperial lovers, showered with titles and privileges. These extravagant practices, beyond their hedonistic nature, also pursued political objectives. They forged a network of personal loyalty to the throne, circumventing the traditional senatorial clientela and reminding all that true power now resided in the hands of the young emperor, whose favor was the key to success. However, this bread and circuses strategy encountered fierce resistance from conservative morality. The populace was shocked to learn that the imperial baths, once symbols of hygiene and purity, had been transformed into venues for public sexual masquerades. Elagabalus generously rewarded participants in his festivities, bestowing minor offices and tax concessions, thereby creating a network of dependent individuals prepared to defend him even in the face of senatorial scorn. Nonetheless, this cult of pleasure sowed seeds of hatred in the hearts of adherents to traditional values and undermined imperial legitimacy with every empty goblet and every night of excess. A pertinent question arises: is it truly possible to effectively govern a vast empire by distributing privileges in exchange for loyalty, knowing that one's political power is founded upon fleeting desires and widespread licentiousness? The era of Elagabalus's reign, marked by its extravagance and outrageousness, provoked a storm of indignation within the Roman aristocracy. Senators, whose souls were steeped in the spirit of the mos maiorum, the unwritten code of their ancestors, watched with apprehension as the grandeur of Jupiter's temple faded in the shadow of Elagabalis's altars. The youthful emperor, clad in women's attire, presided over a women's senate on the quirinal, unsettling minds and sparking whispers behind the scenes of the Palatine. Rumors circulated of foreign cults, scandalous marriages, and imperial orgies that undermined the dignity of the state. The Praetorian Guard, initially welcoming the young emperor's ascent, gradually began to harbor doubts regarding the expediency of executing orders that ran contrary to their military traditions. Veterans, incensed by the emperor's preference for coquettes and courtesans over their comrades in arms, started to reevaluate their allegiance. In this atmosphere of widespread discontent, Julia Misa, deftly weaving a web of intrigues, brought her plan to its culmination. She persuaded Elagabalus to appoint his cousin, Alexander Severus, a 12-year-old boy whose lineage appeared more acceptable to Roman society, as his successor. By spreading rumors of the eccentric emperor's betrayal, Julia skillfully promoted Alexander's figure in the eyes of the troops, cleverly exploiting the burgeoning animosity towards Elagabalus to dismantle his cult. On March 11, 222 AD, the Guard revolted. When Elagabalus arrived at the camp, attempting to quell the mutiny, his voice remained unheard, whilst enthusiastic greetings were directed at Alexander. Without a single drop of blood, yet pierced by the invisible daggers of betrayal, he fell victim to a conspiracy orchestrated by his own grandmother. Julia Misa proclaimed the change of power, thereby sealing the fate of a reign that, after just 4 years, concluded under the blade of a familial conspiracy. Can one truly imagine a conspiracy against one's own grandson, driven by the desire to salvage Rome's honor, utilizing popular indignation and the legion's contempt? On March 11, 222 AD, weary of the depravity and sacrilege, the Praetorian Guard staged a silent revolt. The soldiers proclaimed Alexander Severus, a 12-year-old boy, as their chosen successor, whose inherited features of Caracalla seemed more tolerable to them than the eccentricities of a youth who audaciously defied the gods and established traditions. Elagabalus, confident in the unshakable nature of his position, appeared before the rebels in the square, accompanied by his mother, Julia Soaemias, hoping to quell the mutiny with a single gesture of authority. However, his appearance was met with complete indifference. The Praetorians, as one man, shouted Alexander's name. At that very moment, the order was given for the arrest of the heretic and his advisor. Offering no resistance, both were seized and beheaded. Their naked bodies, paraded through the city streets, were displayed for public viewing as a warning to posterity. Elagabalus's body was thrown into the waters of the Tiber, while Julia Soaemias's remains were consigned to oblivion in an unmarked grave. The Senate immediately issued a decree of damnatio memoriae, ordering that all mention of them be erased from history. Their names were struck from the annals, temples razed to the ground, and edicts annulled. Within a few tragic hours, the young man who had dreamed of divine greatness was transformed from a celestial being into a victim, and his brief and ominous reign became a warning about the limits of power and the transience of earthly existence. Over time, Elagabalus's image became shrouded in myths and legends. During the Middle Ages, influential historians such as Orosius and Jerome presented him as the embodiment of moral decay and imperial collapse. In the Renaissance, Boccaccio, in his works, bitterly described his grandmother, portraying her as a source of corruption and dishonor. Yet, his provocative behavior, expressed through the rejection of traditional gender roles and the granting of political power to women, anticipated modern debates about identity and political equality. Romantic and surrealist writers used his story to create satirical depictions of tyranny and to give voice to the oppressed and marginalized segments of society. Today, His reign is studied not only for its cruelty and eccentricity, but also for the manifestations of social revolution that some discern within it. Elagabalus emerges as a usurper who profoundly altered perceptions of power and gender in the Roman Empire. Elagabalus vividly demonstrates the thin line between genius and madness. This teenager, upon ascending the throne, shook the very foundations of a 1,000-year-old empire by introducing foreign cults, orchestrating bloody feasts, and contracting forbidden marriages. Ultimately, he fell victim to the very audacity that had brought him to power. So, in the author's opinion, who is the true hero of this tragic imperial story? Is it the god who sought to become emperor, the power-hungry grandmother weaving intrigues, or the Praetorian Guard, who restored order and stability?